Well, good afternoon. My name is Charles Bustani. I'm a former member of Congress that represented Louisiana, and I'm a spokesperson for Tariffs, Hurt the Heartland. And I want to welcome you all to the briefing today. Tariffs, Hurt the Heartland is a campaign that's uniting farmers, businessmen across all sectors on Americans, American farmers, American businesses, American consumers. Retaliatory tariffs are also causing problems by creating barriers to American exports. These things are going to hurt the American economy. They are hurting the American economy. And it's time to end the self-inflicted uncertainty and volatility imposed by tariff policies. So if we need any reminder of what the impact of this is, Tariffs Hurt the Heartland has been putting out data, and we're going to be releasing data here today for all of you to further illustrate the damage that is being inflicted on our economy. The report's going to show losses in American jobs, cost to families, and reduction in GDP resulting from the tariffs, and also makes projections of what would happen if the tariffs are escalated, as could happen as described by the administration. So now what I'd like to do is turn to Laura Boffman from the Trade Partnership Worldwide, who has done this analysis and provided this data, and she'll give you an overview, and then we'll continue through with our program. Laura?
Thank you, Dr. Bustani. Good afternoon. We were asked to look at a number of scenarios of tariff imposition that were under discussion by the administration back in, as of November 1st of last year. And I'm going to summarize the results of two of those possible scenarios today. The first is the one that is potentially likely to happen on March 2nd. We looked at the impact of U.S. tariffs under Section 232 on steel and aluminum, plus retaliation by U.S. trading partners, and U.S. tariffs imposed on imports of selected products from China, the so-called lists 1, 2, and 3. And in that case, in the case of list 3, we looked at the imposition of 25% tariffs on those imports. That's the possibility that could happen on March 1st if the U.S. and China do not come to a successful agreement in the Section 301 investigation. Then another scenario that we looked at is what I call euphemistically the trade war scenario, which is where the U.S. imposes duties on imports of steel and aluminum under Section 232, again at 25%, countries retaliate. We impose 25% duties on a selected collection of autos and auto parts from certain countries, not all of them, and those countries retaliate. And then we impose 25% duties on imports of all products from China. What would happen to the U.S. economy and U.S. jobs in each of those two situations? The model that we use to do this is the same model that the U.S. International Trade Commission uses when it conducts an assessment of the economic effects of a trade agreement, as it is doing right now for the USMCA, U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, on the U.S. economy. It's also the same model that the Commerce Department used when it prepared its Section 232 report to the President and came up with the 25%. Well, it actually came up with different tariffs that it recommended to the President, but that's how it came to that assessment of what those tariffs should be. We use the same model. This is a model that captures the up and the downstream and all the interrelated ways in which an increase in costs, which is caused by the tariffs, affect purchases of products, it affects production in the United States, and affects workers. So that's all it in a nutshell. I'll get right to the results. For scenario 1, which is as I say, the base scenario, which is, let's call it the possible March 2 scenario, we found that the imposition of these tariffs will reduce U.S. GDP by 0.37% annually for as long as they're in effect. It will hit the average American family of 4 with an additional $767 in higher costs. Reduced spending power is another way to look at that. And it will have an impact on U.S. net jobs, so the pluses minus the minuses, of 935,000 lost jobs on balance. It works out to roughly 8 job losses for every job created as a result of the tariffs. Every state has a net negative job loss result from the tariffs that could happen on March 2nd. Scenario 2, which is the everything scenario, is much, much, much worse for the U.S. economy. Here we really ramp up the value of imports that are subject to tariffs and the value of exports that are subject to retaliation, and the impact every year on U.S. GDP is a negative 1%. It imposes a hit to the average family of four of almost $2,300 in higher costs and reduced spending, and that does erase the estimated benefits that other people have found for tax reform. It results in a net negative loss of 2.2 million U.S. jobs, and there are net negative losses in every state in the United States. Now, one thing I meant to add, these are results that happen, according to the modeling, that happen after the tariffs have been in effect in the short run, meaning after 1 to 3 years. So not today, but after the tariffs have been in effect for 1 to 3 years, you can expect to see these kinds of impacts on the U.S. economy. In conclusion, what we find is that tariffs do support some jobs in protected industries, and they do increase output in those protected industries, but they also reduce corporate and household spending elsewhere in the economy and economic output and jobs in those other sectors. And when you look at the pluses and you look at the minuses, we find that the minuses vastly outweigh the positives. And so when you're considering tariff policy of this nature, we think it's important that you take the whole picture into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. This is a bipartisan effort, and we're very pleased to have 4 distinguished U.S. senators here to offer some comments. First, we'll go to Senator Tom Carper from Delaware. Senator.
Thanks very much, and good morning. This is a somber-looking group, and for good reason. I just got off the phone. We're joined by Richard Wilkins, who's the president of Delaware. Our first president, before we had governors, we had presidents. And our first president was Caesar Rodney, and who rode his horse from Dover to Philadelphia to cast a tie-breaking vote in favor of the Declaration of Independence. And Richard is a president from Delaware, but he's president of the Delaware Farm Bureau. And before that, he was president of the American Soybean Association. So we actually think he is president in the first state. And happy he's here. And a guy who has farmed for a long time, great farmer, and has a good story to tell on behalf of our farmers. There's a school district in Delaware called Caesar Rodney School District, just south of Dover, and I'm going to be there this Friday, God willing. And I remember when I'd been governor of Delaware, first as a senator, I remember being in the Caesar Rodney School District in an elementary school, and the kids knew I used to be governor. They weren't sure what a senator did, and they said to me in the Q&A in their assembly, they said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I'm a United States Senator. That's what I do." And they said, "Well, what do you do?" And I said, "Well, I help with 99 other senators, the president, and 435 representatives to help make the rules for the country." I asked them if they had rules at school, rules at home, and rules on their buses and everything. They said yes. And I said, "We have rules for our country. We call them laws." And I get to help make the rules for the country. And then there was one kid who raised his hand. He said, "What else do you do?" And he said, "Well, we try to help people." And he said, "How?" And I said, "We try to help people by making sure they have a job, to make sure they have the ability to support themselves and their families. And if you can help somebody in that way, the rest is a whole lot easier." In our state, we only have 3 counties, but Sussex County, the southernmost county where Richard's from, it's one of the top soybean growing counties in America. We raise, I think, more chickens per capita in Delaware, 300 chickens per capita for every person who lives in Delaware. Sussex County may be the top poultry growing county in America. We raise, I think, more lima beans in Delaware than I'm told than maybe any other state in America. So believe it or not, a lot of people in our state make their livelihood from agriculture. And poultry is huge. Soybeans huge. Lima beans are important too, but we raise all this corn, raise all this soybeans, feed the chickens, and then try to sell them to people around the world, especially Canada and Mexico and China. It used to be for every 100 chickens we raised, we'd sell 1 outside of our country. Today we sell, for every 100 that we raise, we sell 20 outside of our country, and that number is growing. I don't know what the weather's been like in your states, but in our state last year, we had twice as much rain as we normally have. Twice as much rain as we normally have. And it's a bad thing we don't have any rain, but it could be a bad thing when you have way too much rain. We had a lot of farmers had to plow their fields under because they just didn't have a crop to harvest. And they relied on crop insurance in order to make a go of it and pay their bills. When you add to that the impact that comes to us from loss of market access, in this case to China, that's a double whammy. And we're looking for potentially an increase in the tariff from 10% to 25% on March 1st, which would make it even worse. There's this saying I write at Amtrak train a lot with Senator Toomey sometimes, and they have a saying at Amtrak that says, when you see something, say something. Well, we're seeing something that we don't like. We're seeing something that, in my state especially, soybean farmers, chicken farmers don't like. And they are collateral damage. It's not fair. I was raised to treat other people the way we want to be treated. We should not be treating our farmers this way. Last word I'll say is this, and when Barack Obama was our president, we had huge disagreements, battles with the Chinese about their stealing our intellectual property. And they used cybersecurity methods to steal our intellectual property. Last year that Barack was president, President Xi came over for a meeting, not here in Washington, but in Washington State. And I have first-hand account from Jay Johnson, who was our Secretary of Homeland Security at the time, and a conversation between President Obama and President Xi went something like this. President Obama to President Xi, we know you're stealing our intellectual property, we know you're using cybersecurity methods to do that, we want you to stop. President Xi responds, we don't do that. Barack responds, we know you do, and here's examples X, Y, and Z, and President Xi said, we don't do that. President Obama responded and said, here are the people that are doing it, and here's where they're doing it, and we want you to stop, and if you don't stop, you'll wish you had. President Xi blinked. This is one of those similar kind of moments. And we've got to be tough with the Chinese. If we're not going to get anywhere. And we've got to also be smart that we don't unintentionally hurt our own farmers, whether it happen to be in Delaware or California or any other place. And it's a tough thing to do, but it's the right thing to do. We've got to figure out how to thread this needle, hit the right balance. But for us, who represent an important agricultural state, it's important that this administration knows they have got to feel a sense of urgency to get this done. Avoid a 25% increase, and to the extent we can, we'll do a good thing for our whole country, and including our agricultural economy. So thank you very much. Please hold your applause.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Pat Toomey has been a stalwart leader in this effort. He has legislation, and I think he wants to say a few words about that.
Thanks very much. Let me start by just observing what is probably obvious to many people here. Trade is good for America. Trade is good for Pennsylvania. Over 1.4 million jobs in Pennsylvania are supported by international trade. And jobs in export-related industries tend to pay more, 18% higher wages on average. Trade wars are very, very dangerous. Tariffs, as has been observed, are taxes paid by consumers. And when you raise the cost of imports, you impede trade, you raise costs for consumers, and tit-for-tat tariffs as a negotiating tactic can be very, very dangerous indeed. Very briefly, the impact on Pennsylvania is already very real from the steel and aluminum tariffs that were imposed under President Trump's direction invoking Section 232 of our trade law, which purports that the trade with Canada and Mexico in particular in steel and aluminum are somehow a threat to national security. Let me give you an example of some of the consequences. Allegheny Technologies. Allegheny Technologies is located in the Pittsburgh area, a slab conversion steel mill. They've paid over $16 million in tariffs to import steel slab. Those expenses get passed on to their customers. This is an American steel company that is being hurt by these tariffs. American Keg, the only remaining United States manufacturer of stainless steel beer kegs, based in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, was forced to lay off 1/3 of their workforce in March of last year because the tariffs and the high prices of steel that result from the tariffs. Colonial Metal Products, a small manufacturer in Hermitage, Pennsylvania, supplies specialty metal products such as tin plate. And they've told my office that all 45 jobs at this small company are at risk because domestic costs of tin plate are up 25%. See, here's the bottom line in the dynamic here. There are about 140,000 workers who are employed by steel companies who are meant to benefit from these steel tariffs. There are 6.5 million people employed in companies that use steel. And in my view, it shouldn't be so easy for any one individual, be it a member of Congress or the President of the United States, to impose tariffs that can be so economically disruptive and so problematic, and to do it unilaterally. So I've introduced legislation. It is bipartisan. It is bicameral. I've done it jointly with Senator Warner, and it addresses this problem. Senator Johnson is a co-sponsor of this legislation. I appreciate his support. And what our bill would do is very simple. It would simply restore the responsibility over establishing these kinds of tariffs where the Constitution puts that responsibility, and that is with the Congress. The Constitution is unambiguous. It's very clear. Imposition of tariffs is a responsibility of Congress. And so what our bill would do is it proposes that if a president, this or a future president, thinks that tariffs are necessary for national security purposes, then he or she can make the case to Congress, and Congress would be required to respond. There would be a requirement for an expedited process in which Congress would either agree that the president is right, this is a national security threat that requires tariffs, or Congress could decide it's not. Couldn't be filibustered, couldn't be delayed. Congress would have to act. There's one other important aspect, and that is we also would restore the national security intent to this Section 232 tariff. This is old legislation, but our bill would make it clear that the national security is distinct from just the general welfare of the United States of America. And because we think that distinction is important, we would shift the responsibility for making that determination from the Commerce Department to the Department of Defense, where the expertise about national security really lies. This would preclude any future administration from being able to unilaterally invoke national security as an excuse to impose these taxes. It would restore the responsibility that the Constitution gives to Congress, and it would not at all preclude the use of tariffs if there were a genuine national security need for them and the President was able to convince the elected representatives of the American people. So I'd be grateful for your support for this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. Let's next go to Senator Mark Warner from Virginia to get a Virginia perspective.
Thank you, and let me also first thank so many of you who've traveled from around the country to come to this event, because what we've seen is that this administration's trade policies are hurting businesses, they're hurting workers, they're hurting farmers. Shortly, you're going to hear from Scott Harris from Virginia, who has got a distillery out in Loudoun County, and the fact of these trade policies have stopped, at least for the time being, his expansion of a very, very successful business. On that same theme, I've visited a number of craft breweries in Virginia. Breweries, cideries. I heard from a recent cidery that couldn't afford to actually even buy their aluminum cans to put their product in place. Visited back in December a localized bike assembly facility called Pello Bikes down in Richmond. Great small business. But the effect of this president's tariff policy was basically making this small business unsustainable, particularly during the holiday season. And while we hear from the administration that this is supposed to be about protecting jobs, I'd like those same folks from the administration to go down and visit one of our auto manufacturing facilities in Chesapeake, 400 jobs. We're actually thinking about relocating their facility because of the effects of this tariff and the president's trade policies. As others have mentioned, and I take a back seat to no one on pointing out the challenges posed by China. Intellectual property theft, and Senator Carper mentioned, for a brief period of time, China stopped some of those activities, but they have restarted in terms of intellectual property theft. They put enormous burdens on American businesses going into their market in terms of, in effect, giving up the company's family jewels just to get access to the Chinese market. Increasingly, we have seen a growing recognition, not just here in America, but from countries all around the world, that we need to face this Chinese threat, particularly in advanced technology, in a coordinated way. And the truth was, one of the things I'd hoped from this administration was to put together that organized effort against the rising challenge of China. But instead, what we've seen is this White House pick fights with folks like Harley Davidson and Justin Trudeau, rather than where some of the real challenges lie, particularly in terms of Chinese technology policy. To me, it is more than a little bit challenging and strange to explain to our Canadian partners and allies, our allies in Europe, friends and allies in Mexico, that this administration would use Section 232, a national security requirement, to frankly go after longstanding countries that have been our allies and partners literally for decades and decades. And that's why I joined my friend Pat Toomey in the legislation that he explained that gives Congress back that ability, an ability that candidly has not been misused in recent decades until now, to have Congress be able to weigh in. And if there is truly a national security concern, an administration with the agreement of Congress ought to make that happen. But we should not have it misused, as it has been particularly in the case of our neighbors to the north. So I do hope that the stories you'll hear, the data that's been presented about the effect that this administration's trade policies is having, that will be rethought, the jobs that are being affected, the businesses, the workers, the farmers. There's an ability for us to change that. We thank all of you for coming in so we can get that message across. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Next, we'll hear from Senator Ron Johnson from Wisconsin to give you a Wisconsin perspective. There have been some high-profile situations there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Charles. Thanks, all of you, for attending. I definitely want to thank the Tariffs Hurt the Heartland organization for putting on this event and really developing these stories, because it's the power of the anecdote that hopefully will turn the tide and bring a little more rational approach in terms of how we actually do achieve the goals that I think most of us agree with. And let's start there. I mean, I think there's no doubt about the fact that America's been very magnanimous in our trading relationship with the world. Things like the Marshall Plan are highly beneficial. But with our generosity, I think we've been taken advantage of, and I think this administration has recognized that. Prior administrations have as well. But this administration is trying to reset that global trading regime and certainly address China's unconscionable and just unacceptable theft of all of our intellectual property, both industrial as well as military secrets. So we share that goal. Our concern is really what the strategy is to achieve that goal, and in particular, the harm being done along the way. Great article in the Wall Street Journal on Monday talking about how the benefits of the tariffs are pretty well known, very targeted toward the steel industry. But the damage, the harm is very diffuse and affecting businesses large and small. I think the numbers that Laura provided were quite shocking. Long-term, 900,000 job losses, but again, those are projections, so they'll be marginalized. We can go back in history when George W. Bush enacted steel tariffs. Realized after about a year that they weren't working too well. A study afterwards that was conducted said there were about 200,000 jobs lost in the economy. So, those are projections. Those were, what Laura's providing in projections, but that's pretty much history. And we know that diffuse harm that can be, unbelievably damaging. In terms of benefits, back of the envelope calculation, in 2015, total industry profits in the steel industry, there were none. It was a net loss. 2016, about a $714 million total profit. 2017, again, this is before the tariffs were enacted, about $2.8 billion. And just based on the profit increase announced by the three top steel companies, this year's profitability is going to be more than $5 billion. Now, I'm a capitalist. I have no problem in companies making money. And again, I am a business person. I'm an accountant. I'm a manufacturer for 30 years. There's nothing I would, as a manufacturer, love more than have my price increases basically sanctioned and supported by the federal government. But that would do an awful lot of harm to my customers, and that's exactly what is happening. You've already heard a couple case studies. We're developing a pretty long list. We've provided those to the administration repeatedly. We will continue to do that. It's very important that people who are being harmed by these tariffs and by the retaliation do step up to the plate and show that harm, and we need to accumulate it so we've got the numbers to convince this administration to conclude these trade deals as quickly as possible to mitigate current harm and avert future harm. But I want to take on my U.S. Senator's hat, and I just want to describe why we have these types of job losses. I was in manufacturing for 30-some years in the plastics industry, so didn't use a whole lot of steel, but I understand global supply chains. We export to 20 different countries. When you export into global markets, first of all, that benefits American jobs. You need engineering, you need administration, you need all kinds of jobs in America to support those exports. But one of the first things that happens is those export markets get larger and larger. First of all, the customers want you as a manufacturer close to them. So there's an awful lot of pressure to move your manufacturing overseas to address that market. Now, many companies move manufacturing overseas, and it makes sense. And it doesn't really harm the U.S. economy. It continues to benefit us because we have those administrative and engineering jobs here. But if you don't move your manufacturing overseas, you totally lose that market, and those jobs that are here domestically also get lost. What is so damaging about these, particularly steel tariffs, they're creating a difference between global competitors of U.S. companies that are manufacturing overseas for those global markets. They are more competitive. Also, and I'm not encouraging, blanket tariffs, but they can also compete more effectively domestically. So you've got manufacturers completely unaffected by all the steel and aluminum tariffs. Their costs are quite a bit lower, so they can compete and take all the global international customers from domestic manufacturers, as well as come in and compete effectively here. So what is that going to force U.S. manufacturers to do? Well, again, there's already pressure to manufacture for your overseas customers overseas. So instead of actually incentivizing more U.S. manufacturing long-term, and again, we don't see the full amount of damage because people have been able to live off inventories, that type of thing, but intermediate to long-term, there will be a great deal of pressure of U.S. manufacturers if they want to remain globally competitive and maintain their global international markets. The incentive will be to move their manufacturing overseas, totally contrary to what this administration is doing. My final point, and this is one of those anecdotes. One of our first roundtables, we had about 15 different Wisconsin businesses. One was Chippewa Valley Bean Company. The owner was Cindy Brown. And this is a 160-year-old company. And this is a quote from Cindy Brown. She said, "In that 160 years, there's been no government action that has left us in such terrible shape as this has." Now, this was months ago. I just met with Cindy Brown yesterday. The situation hasn't improved. She competes with Chinese and Canadian bean growers for the European market. So what's happened is not only have her prices been incredibly depressed for her to sell any because she has to make up that difference in tariffs, what's happening right now is China and Canada are increasing their plantings while U.S. farmers are having to decrease theirs. The longer this trade war goes on, the longer these tariffs are in place, the greater and more permanent will be the damage done. So again, I just want to thank this organization for bringing to light and publicizing the harm that's being done. Hopefully it'll have an impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. We have three business persons here who are going to offer their perspectives, but I want to be respectful of these four senators' time. So if there are any questions for the four senators here, let's keep it to the topic here that's being addressed and not wide-ranging. But if there are any questions, please identify yourself and your organization. Yes.
Yeah, from Fox Business Network, everyone. I'm just curious, are you saying drop these tariffs today? And then can you address the fact that these tariffs bring these countries to the table?
Let me quick, so obviously this administration is using tariffs to bring these countries to the table, and they've worked pretty effectively. Both the president as well as Wilbur Ross, when it came to the new NAFTA, the USMCA, said that once that agreement is signed, not ratified, signed, the steel and aluminum tariffs would go away on Mexico and Canada. That hasn't happened. So I think what we're certainly saying is, honor what you said earlier about that. It just makes sense. If you're using the tariffs as leverage, if you get agreement with countries that have come to the table because of that, if you don't relieve them of the tariffs, you're going to marginalize that as an effective leverage point for other negotiations as well. So no, I'm certainly calling to end the steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada and Mexico. And again, the other thing I'm urging is please conclude these other trade agreements as quickly as possible, particularly with our allies, because I think if we can go to China as a united world, we have a far better chance of making sure that they abide by the rules and stop stealing our industrial secrets.
So slightly different take on this than my friend Senator Johnson. I don't think there's any doubt that the tariffs of steel and aluminum imposed on Canada and Mexico coerced them to come to the bargaining table. The result was an agreement that diminishes trade opportunities between the three countries. The new NAFTA has impediments to trade relative to the old NAFTA. For instance, it has all kinds of restrictions on the sales of autos. Additional costs, minimum wage requirements, quotas, tariffs on automobile trade. There's no question it significantly impedes trade in automobiles. It puts an arbitrary deadline on the entire agreement so that it expires, which just creates uncertainty that's got to diminish investment. It does away with the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, almost entirely with Canada and largely with Mexico, which also will tend to have a chilling effect on investment. So I understand that I disagree with it, but I understand the logic of using these tariffs to try to pressure people to come to the negotiating table. But what good is that if the outcome is a diminished trading relationship between really important trade partners?
Next question. Yes.
I think the reason why President Xi apparently blinked about 3 years ago in the state of Washington in his negotiations with President Obama was because President Obama made it real clear that we meant business. And I think in order to get them to take seriously us now, I think we need to make clear that we mean business. And we want them to stop what they're doing in terms of their trade policy with us and other countries. So there's a careful balance here that when we want to be speaking with two voices, one to the Chinese and say, we really mean this, and another one says, well, you wait long enough and you'll be successful. We got to be very careful with that. The other thing we have to be real careful with our own administration is to make sure that they know that the folks in the Port of Wilmington and other ports around America who actually, we have number 4 cargo moving through the Port of Wilmington is steel and aluminum. And we are a large grower of, as I said earlier, soybeans and chickens. But we want the administration to be mindful as they do this negotiation, try to get us to a good place with China, that in the meantime, there are folks in this country that are being hurt unintentionally. They expect us, when we see something, to say something, and that's what we're doing.
I think there was a real chance to build a broad-based international coalition about the challenges that China poses intellectual property theft, artificial intelligence, 5G, quantum computing, areas that should be American leadership or Western leadership. And instead, a lot of the goodwill that could have gone into that coalition was used under Section 232, basically taking on our allies that should be natural allies in some of these concerns with China. And there are, again, we'll see what happens coming up with the March deadline. But one of the things that I would hope when the administration sees something, for example, in the case of ZTE, where there is virtual unanimity from the intelligence community, they ought to stick to their guns rather than backing off when they had the first back pressure from China. My apologies, I've got to head off, but.
I just want very briefly, just want to clarify on 232 tariffs. You know, the fact is 70% of U.S. consumption of steel is produced by the U.S. About 3% of our consumption is necessary for national security. The fact is there was never a national security reason to impose 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum anywhere. And so they should not have been imposed. And in my view, they should all be lifted yesterday.
Thanks, Senator. I want to thank the senators for being with us. We're going to continue with our program. Senators, thank you all. Really appreciate it. Next, we're going to hear from Michael Rinsler. He's the owner of Wicked Cool Toys in Bristol, Pennsylvania. Michael?
Thank you. I think next time maybe we should go first. I'm not sure. Good afternoon. I'm Michael Rinsler, co-president and founding partner of Wicked Cool Toys, toy manufacturer based in Bristol, Pennsylvania. To begin, I would like to thank the senators for coming here today, especially Senator Toomey from my home state in Pennsylvania. To me, at least, this is how things are supposed to work, where government leadership from both sides come together to problem solve important issues. I'm proud to be here today representing the toy industry to tell you my personal story of the little guy, that's figuratively, not literally, and how tariffs really would affect all toy companies across the nation. Wicked Cool Toys was started 6 years ago in 2012. We now employ over 100 people between 3 offices in Pennsylvania, California, and Hong Kong. I co-founded Wicked Cool Toys with a very close friend, Thomas Poon, who is of Chinese descent. He is also a Hong Kong resident and a longtime factory owner in China. We design, develop, and market many well-known toys that children love, hopefully a lot of you know and love, including all the Pokemon toys. We now make all the Cabbage Patch Kids, for those who had those growing up, and WWE, to name a few. While the toy business is definitely a lot of fun, we take the responsibility of making high-quality, safe products very seriously. Like most entrepreneurs, we faced a lot of challenges during our first 6 years in business. Starting a business is not easy. Scott and I talked about that a little bit earlier. But we have grown every single year, and we've continued to hire more people every single year since we've been in business. Yet now, due to the threat of impending tariffs, our future is uncertain. So, fact, China supplies 85% of all the toys sold in the U.S. That's almost, obviously, all the toys that come into the country. While the heavy lifting of design, sales, and marketing is conducted here at home, the combination of cost efficiencies and labor expertise obtained by manufacturing toys in China cannot be duplicated in the U.S. Tariffs on toys would result in higher prices to all key stakeholders: American businesses, American retailers, and ultimately, American consumers. Toy manufacturers would have no choice but to raise prices if tariffs get implemented, which will result in consumers having to pay significantly more for our products. Toy sales would most definitely decline, which in turn would result in the loss of tens of thousands of jobs in our industry. There's no winning outcome here. The threat of tariffs is making it very difficult to manage our business currently. Decisions on manufacturing, pricing, and future product planning are all up in the air right now while we wait to see what unfolds. Investment in new American-based jobs are dependent on the outcome of these tariffs and what happens. The U.S. toy industry strongly opposes any additional tariffs on toy imports. Let's solve any trade issues with China more diplomatically before it causes damage to our economy and American families. Kids, and hopefully some of you maybe still play with toys too, deserve to be able to obtain their favorite toys as they always have. Thank you for the time here today.
Thank you, Michael. Next, we'll hear from Scott Harris. He's from Purcellville, Virginia, and the founder of Catoctin Creek Distillery.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for the chance to speak today. So I am the founder and general manager of Catoctin Creek Distillery. We're located about 1 hour west of here in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. And just to tell you a little bit about our company, we are a small family-run company. My wife is the chief distiller, and my children both work in sales for the company. So we are literally a family mom-and-pop shop. I'm Pop, and we make whiskey for a living. And we started 10 years ago. Next week is our 10th anniversary. And what our company represents, first and foremost, is about 20 employees that we started in our hometown. And then, but that represents just the tip of the iceberg. We have farmers, so we have rye farmers in Virginia, in Pennsylvania, where we get rye grain from. We have cattle farmers who we give our spent grains to as cattle feed, so we support cattle farming as well. We have bottle manufacturers in Pennsylvania, Western PA, all of our bottles are made there. We have cork and closure capsule makers in Charleston, South Carolina. We have labels made in Ohio and labels made in California. So you can see there's a lot of jobs that are impacted. If our number of cases sold goes down, then those orders go down as well, and those jobs are impacted. So that's just a brief sort of slice of how our one company affects all those different jobs. Our company is one of 1,000 distillers in America today, so, and growing. So that is big guys and little guys alike. And so any little company like mine with just 20 people, the effects that we're seeing get magnified across the country in every single state in the nation. So I would tell you a little story just to kind of put this into some perspective of how this affects our company. We, in the 10 years that we've been in business, have been growing. We're now in 26 states in the United States. And in the past half decade or so, we've seen competition grow fiercely. So there were maybe 100 distillers when we started, and today there's 1,000. So a tenfold increase since we started the company. And so competition in the US is quite difficult. And one of the things as a small business that we thought would be good to continue to grow our company and to find profitable markets was to look at other places, and Europe was the number one choice that we looked at. So 5 years ago, we began going to Europe and studying the market and working to find importers and doing all the hard work there. And much of that work was also done hand in hand with the Virginia Department of Agriculture. So the Virginia Department of Agriculture and the Distilled Spirits Council both received money to help promote U.S. exports in these countries. So it is U.S. policy into finances that say that we want to sell more to Europeans and places abroad. And I can't think of a cooler U.S. agricultural export than whiskey. And so whiskey sells well. We have a great cachet in places like Europe. Bourbon is very well thought of in Germany and Italy and all of these places. And so we thought this would be a very fertile marketplace for our products. And so in that 5 years that we were going overseas, we were working hard to start to grow some small footprint in countries like Italy and Germany and Finland and Holland and these kinds of places. So in March of 2018, almost a year ago, we were on a Virginia Department of Agriculture sponsored trade mission in London. With the explicit purpose of building distributor and retail relationships. We were meeting with the Savoy, which is the preeminent hotel cocktail bar in London. We were meeting with Claridge's, which is another one, with Harrods, which is, of course, the famous grocery retail or department store retailer. Places like this. We had about 12 different pre-orders, I would say, and a meeting with our distributor to sign a deal with the distributor who would then take the products into London and distribute them and have the sales team on the streets to bring the product every week to these places. All of this was extremely successful. We were ready to have a big launch event in April, and we came home with basically deals in hand, handshake agreements that we had to finish signing. And 2 weeks later, the trade tariffs were imposed. And our distributor in London stopped returning our phone calls. He simply stopped responding. We never heard from him again. And without a distributor, you can't sell directly from the US into these small retailers. You have to have a local presence. And so all of that work has been suspended. We were planning last year for 25% of our revenue to be represented by European sales, a large part of it in the London market. And today our sales in London is zero. So we've lost that opportunity because of these tariffs. Had they not been in place, we would have probably had at least a few $100,000 worth of sales in London. The real risk now, of course, there's that lost opportunity, but other people are making those sales while we're not here. So when America from Japan and India has very good whiskey now, and they're selling it in Europe. So all of these countries get a chance to build their market share, their mind share, and just like the soybean farmers, that's an opportunity that could be lost permanently if it goes on for long enough. So that's kind of my story about how these tariffs have affected our company, and I appreciate you guys letting me take a minute just to tell you that.
Thank you, Scott, for sharing your story. And last but certainly not least, we're going to hear from Richard Wilkins of Greenwood, Delaware, who is the president of Delaware Farm Bureau.
Well, thank you and good afternoon. And it's a pleasure to be here to speak on behalf of America's farmers. I appreciate my Senator Carper mentioning putting a plug in for lima beans, and it would be remiss for me to not let the mothers and fathers in the room know that in our state and on my farm, I'm doing everything that we can to improve the texture, the flavor, the taste, and the appeal to the sensory receptors so that you have an easier job of getting your children to eat their lima beans, my family. So about 45 years ago, my father sat me down. I was a teenager, and he said, "Son, I see the passion that you have for being a farmer, but I need to let you know that I'm not going to be able to give you this farm. This is my retirement, and you're going to have to find a way on your own." Well, I was young. I was brash. I thought, piece of cake, not going to be any problem. So about 5 years later, I had that realization that, hey, wow, this is going to be tough to acquire the capital to be able to enter into this industry, to be able to enter into this business. So I made the decision then to further my education and go back to school and learn more about the science and the business that I had a passion for. About 10 years later, I met a beautiful young lady that shared the same passion that I had to want to become a full-time sustaining farmer. At the time, I was working a full-time job off the farm. She was working a full-time job. Side by side, this beautiful young lady and I sacrificed so many things in our lives to be able to acquire the capital, to be able to purchase our first farm, to be able to do the job that we had so much passion to do. About that same time, the American Soybean Association had opened up an office in Beijing, China, to cultivate a relationship with a growing economy, an emerging economy, a growing middle class, and to ensure that as they needed to increase their consumption of protein, that it would be United States protein that they were consuming. So about another 10 years later, my sister's son came to me and said, "Uncle Richard, I'm kind of frustrated with being a mid-level supervisor in a factory world. Is there room for me to enter into this business with you?" So we found a way. We created another enterprise to be able to place him into the family operation, and we're glad that he's still able to be with us today. So for the last several years, this is a story about what we're doing. So my wife and I are trying to, certainly sustain our life. We have my nephew's family that needs to make a living out of our farming operation. My older brother, who is retired, is on a fixed income. He needs some supplemental income, so during the seasons, I try to find as many hours of work that I can give him so I can pay him some money to help supplement his fixed income. My mother is also on a fixed income Social Security. For many years, we've been giving her $400 a month to help supplement her fixed income. Our business plan that we created just a couple years ago was, with the amount of money that we're paying for health insurance premiums, is simply to avoid bankruptcy until my wife and I are able to apply for Medicaid and get some supplemental help on our health insurance care cost through that program. And I tell you all this because, starting in 2013, our business, the agricultural business, started a slide in our net farm income. Over the next 5 years, between 2013 and 2018, we saw a 50% reduction. Our take-home pay, our net farm income, got cut in half. Last July, when the tariffs were placed on the steel and aluminum imports into this country, and China placed retaliatory tariffs on soybeans, the United States soybeans going into China, that started a slide in the value of that commodity that I produce, soybeans, of 20%. So on top of an already 50% reduction in overall net farm income, now I've had to be hurt by this 20% reduction in the value of one crop that's important to our operation, soybeans. Now, we have a diversified operation. We grow many other crops. We also raise livestock. But the buyers of all those other crops, knowing that the price of soybeans and the value of soybeans has slid by 20%, they don't have to offer as high a price for the crops that they want me to grow because they know that the alternative that they're bidding against has a lower price also. So it's not just impacting that one commodity, soybeans. It's not just impacting cherries. It's not just impacting whiskey. It's impacting everything in the agricultural economy. On top of that, we're an industry that relies upon steel and aluminum and the products that we need to run our businesses. We've seen 25% increases in the cost of some of those inputs that we have to purchase. Now, because China has not been buying the level of soybeans that they have been purchasing from the United States, they not only have been seeking their supplies from other nations, other competing countries that also grow soybeans, but they've also discovered that they don't need to use as much soybean meal in their rations as they once were. So a Chinese swine producer, realizing a 25% increase in the cost of soybeans to him, started looking for alternative proteins, started looking for alternative ways to be able to still produce the meat, but at a lower cost. This has long-term implications, because if they've discovered that they didn't need as high an inclusion rate of soybean meal in their rations to begin with, then we're never going to get that inclusion rate back again. So last year we produced just over 4 billion bushels of soybeans in this country, the United States. Today, the projected carryout for this year's crop is nearly 1 billion bushels. So between 20 and 25% of last year's crop, our 2018 crop, is still going to be sitting in the silos and the storage bins when we begin harvesting next year's crop. This situation is going to have a long tail if you put it in the lingo of market economists. This carryover, this burdensome excess supply, is going to hurt the prices of our commodities for the next several years to come. The other thing it's going to do is it's going to create permanent damage with these trading relationships that we have built in overseas markets. It's not just China, it's Mexico, it's Canada, it's European Union, and it's even some of these other markets that are emerging that they may not be impacted by the tariff, by the steel and aluminum tariffs, but they say, if the President of the United States can put a tariff on steel and aluminum just because he can, what could he do to our country? What could he do if whatever product that those emerging markets are exporting into the world trade, relying upon a balance of trade with the United States, what could they do to them? And they start thinking, maybe we shouldn't rely upon the United States as our sole supplier. Maybe we should diversify. Maybe we should look for other sources. So that's the implication, is that when you damage a good trading relationship, the price that you pay has a very long tail, and you can suffer for many years to come. So I appreciate the opportunity to address you, and our message is, please rescind these tariffs today. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions for these three gentlemen? They've shared their stories with you. We're certainly happy to answer any questions. Or any questions about the data? Yes?
Listening to all three, have you had a chance to visit with members of Congress and what kind of response?
So early on, I had the opportunity to sit in with some other companies for meetings with the Commerce Department. And our message at that time was, please get to the table, let's get these things resolved. That was probably a year ago, April or sometime after that. Our responses, I continue to send things to our Congress people and our senators. Our ask is just to get to the table, get through these and resolve them and make them go away. And we haven't had much reason for hope in that regard. Yeah, in my case, in Virginia, they do sympathize with us, but it's, I think Senator Warner's bill with the other gentleman, the other senator, I forget which, it was Mr. Toomey, yes, Mr. Toomey. I think that's a great, I was excited to hear about that. That was the first I've heard of that bill. I think that's a great first start for this kind of thing. I know these things take time, so we're hopeful that comes quickly.
It's a very good question. I can tell you that that I and my colleagues have been canvassing the Hill since January of 2017. We began to visit with our congressional delegations even before the tariffs were placed, to warn of what the damages could be if this type of a trade war was initiated. I feel that we were successful at delaying it as long as we could. But unfortunately, other interests were able to have the president's ear, maybe both ears, where we only had part of one ear, and we weren't successful. Since that time, messages that I've heard on the Hill have varied from, yes, we feel we realize your pain and we're going to help you as much as we can to try to push back on this and find solutions, solutions such as what Senator Warner and Senator Toomey are proposing today. On the other extreme, it's been, wow, this really sucks for you. But it's important for us to be tough. And it's your responsibility as an American farmer to make a sacrifice for your nation. We are patriots. Yes, we do feel that it is our responsibility to make some sacrifices for the good of our country. But I can tell you that back home, my wife and I, we are fortunate because we've worked really hard and we've built up some equity, and we have equity in our assets that we can borrow against to possibly get us through this. But I look around in my community and my neighbors at the young farmers, the young men and women that have just entered into this industry in the last 5 or 6 years. They don't have that equity. And they're looking at, will we be able to continue? Will we be able to actually do this job that we have a passion and we have a love for? Or are we going to have to exit this industry and go get a job in a factory somewhere? So, yeah, when somebody says this really sucks for you, that hurts me very much. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes? The answer is no? Sounds like the answer is no. Other questions? Yes?
The tariffs for Heartland is very opposed and very aggressive in your releases and today. Do you have a sense that you can halfway beyond a small group of lawmen who have been critical of tariffs? Do you feel as though gaining momentum in Congress?
Yes, I do believe that this is the most effective grassroots effort to date, and it's building momentum. Nothing's more powerful than the personal stories you heard. You just heard 3 stories from different folks, different states. We're hearing this repeatedly across the country. We've had 15 events, and we're going to escalate our efforts to make sure that all these stories are put out there. Plus, we're backing that with macroeconomic data to show what this impact's going to be ultimately and how harmful it's going to be to the U.S. economy. We are convinced this is bad policy. And I agree with the senators earlier. There's a better way, a more strategic way to deal with the threat of China. But the problem is, you don't want to create this massive collateral damage to the U.S. economy and to so many individuals, whether they're family farms, small family businesses, large companies, our export industry. That's not the way to go about it. So we're coupling the stories across the country, which are growing, and as more brave and courageous folks come out to tell their stories, others will be encouraged to do so as well. And we do believe this is starting to have an impact on the Hill. I think I'm fairly certain that Senator Toomey was listening to his constituents in Pennsylvania when he decided to go forth and author this bill and to get Senator Warner, so a bipartisan effort. And they're building co-sponsors on the bill. The bill now has a companion in the House. Last year, we didn't see any activity in the House with regard to addressing the tariff problem. So I think more and more members of Congress, both in the House and now and certainly in the Senate, are becoming aware of the problem and more intent on doing something about it. So I think this tariffs hurt the heartlands. It's really having an impact. It is the most effective vehicle so far. Yes? Well, I think there is macroeconomic data that looks good, but I can tell you it'd be even better if we didn't have these tariffs in place. And if we get to the next, and the longer this goes, the more the headwind's going to build, first off. And if the tariffs are escalated, it's going to have a real detrimental impact. We're going to see an impact on jobs and on GDP. I'm convinced of that. And I think some of this data here depicts that scenario. So we are very concerned about it. And I think that, what was the last part of your question? It was, well, there was some applause, but I think there's also some opposition in both parties. I frankly would be surprised if that legislation moves, but we are certainly watching it, and we will mount an effort against it. Yes?
So we know the fear about losing market access to alloy tariffs. Is there also a concern that here in the United States, because this is taxed on consumers, that consumers may start looking towards fake, cheap, knockoff products to replace, these normal everyday products that they can afford for?
Well, it's certainly a possibility. And we believe that with the current trade policy, the United States, whether you're talking about farmers or small business owners or even large companies, are going to lose out in export markets and in economic growth because tariffs are hurting the heartland, period. Thank you very much. We appreciate you all covering this.